Robert Edward Lee, Part 2. Apparent, every plan which Lee formed for the Battle of Gettysburg, every order which he gave, was wise and right. We do not accept even his management on the third day. It is easy to find fault with dispositions when they have failed of happy results. Men have said that instead of tacking in front on that day, Lee should have drawn Ewell from the left and thrown him to Longstreet's right, maneuvering Meade out of his position. But in this matter, too, Lee's judgment was probably good. Changing his plan of attack would have been a partial confession of defeat, to some extent disheartening his men. The Union Sixth Corps, fresh and free, General John Sedgwick at its head, was sure to have pounced on any troops seeking to trouble Meade's left, and had Meade been successfully flanked and forced back, he would have retired to Pipe Creek and been stronger than ever. Of course, Pickett should never have been sent forward alone. You could wade the Atlantic as easily as he, unsupported, could go beyond that stone wall. But, from all one can learn, Lee was in fact not responsible for Pickett's lack of support, although in almost guilty nobleness of spirit he assumed the responsibility and silently rested under the imputation of it till his death. Had Lee's great subordinates, Ewell at nightfall on the first day and Longstreet on the other 2 days, seconded him with the alacrity and devotion usually displayed by them, or had Stonewall Jackson been still alive and in the place of either of these generals, the issue of the battle would almost to a certainty have been very different from what it was. A soldier who had often followed to victory the enterprising Graham of Claverhouse, but under a weaker leader saw a battle wavering, cried out, "Oh, for 1 hour of Dundee!" So must Lee often have sighed for Stonewall, the loss of whom at Chancellorsville made that, for the Confederacy, a sort of Pyrrhic victory. Lee's skill at Gettysburg has been questioned in that he fought his army upon the longer line, the big fish-hook described by his position lying outside the little one formed by the Federal army. But Lee fought on the outer line also at Second Bull Run, winning one of the neatest victories in modern warfare. John Codman Ropes, the well-known military critic, says of this battle, "It would be hard to find a better instance of that masterly comprehension of the actual condition of things which marks a great general than was exhibited in General Lee's allowing our formidable attack, in which more than half the Federal army was taking part, to be fully developed and to burst upon the exhausted troops of Stonewall Jackson, while Lee, relying upon the ability of that able soldier to maintain his position, was maturing and arranging for the great attack on our left flank by the powerful corps of Longstreet." In Prussia's war with Austria in 1866, von Moltke's plan at the Battle of Sadowa, where he splendidly triumphed, was in the same respect a close imitation of Lee's at Gettysburg. The Prussians occupied the outer fish-hook line, the Austrians the inner. When the pickets closed in the morning, von Moltke saluted King William and said, "Your Majesty will today win not only the battle, but the campaign." At noon this did not appear possible. Prince Frederick Charles's corps were withering under the hottest artillery fire of the century, save that at Gettysburg, just 3 years earlier to the hour. It seemed as if in 15 minutes they must give way. But hark! What means that cheering on the left? New cannons boom, and the Austrian fire slackens. Von Moltke knows perfectly well what it means. The Crown Prince has arrived with his fresh corps. He has stormed the heights of Chlum, the Kulp's Hill of that battlefield. He enfilades the whole Austrian line. Benedek is beaten. On to Vienna. The war is ended. It was with a heavy heart that General Lee ordered his brave men southward again, a heart made heavier by many a stinging criticism against him in the Southern press. The resolution that bore him up at this crisis was morally sublime. He could not hope to strengthen his army more. For a time he had to weaken it by sending Longstreet west to assist Bragg in fighting the Battle of Chickamauga. Clothing, rations, animals, and forage, as well as men, were increasingly scarce. The South was exhausted much sooner than any expected, having greatly overestimated its wealth by taking exports and imports for gauge. Doubtful if ever before was so large and populous a region so far from self-sustaining. The force against Lee, on the other hand, was daily becoming stronger. Till Gettysburg, Lee had toyed with the Army of the Potomac, not because the rank and file of that army was at fault, and not mainly because of its general's inability, but mostly because of political interference with its operations. The great and revered President Lincoln, with all his powers, was not a military man. No more was Secretary Stanton. They secured the best military aid they could. From an early period, General Halleck, Old Brains, men called him because of his immense military information, was their constant adviser, and though he was a scholar rather than a genius, he could doubtless have saved them many an error had they heeded his counsel instead of civilian clamor. How impressively did not the Civil War teach that fine military scholarship alone, while it may greatly add to a general's efficiency, cannot make a true military leader. Compare Halleck with Grant or Sherman. The Creoles of Louisiana considered their Beauregard the ne plus ultra military genius of the South. One of them was once asked his opinion of General Lee. He replied in his broken English, "Oh, Gen Lee, a very good general indeed. Gen Beauregard speak very favorable of Gen Lee." So at last did Halleck speak very favorable of Grant. But Gettysburg convinced Lee that he could toy with the Potomac Army no longer, and this was more than ever impossible after Grant took command. Then Greek met Greek, and the death grapple began. At the Wilderness, at Spotsylvania, and most mercilessly of all at Cold Harbor, Grant drove his colossal battering ram against Lee's gray wall, only to find it solid as Gibraltar. This struggle tested both commanders' mettle to the utmost. At the end of the hammering campaign, after losing men enough to form an army as large as Lee's, Grant's van was full twice as far from Richmond as McClellan's had been 2 years before. Not once was Lee flanked, duped, or surprised. As always hitherto, so now. His darling mode of defense was offense, to fight, Grant's every blow being met with another before it hit. Only once were Lee's lines forced straight back to stay. Even then, at the Spotsylvania bloody angle, the ground he lost hardly sufficed to graveyard the Union men killed in getting it. In swinging round to Petersburg, and again at the springing of the Petersburg mine, Grant thought himself sure to make enormous gains, but Lee's insight into his purposes and lightning celerity in checkmating these foiled both movements, giving the mine operation, moreover, the effect of a deadly boomerang. Spite of all this, the end of the Confederacy was in sight from the moment of Grant's arrival at Petersburg. During the 3 years that Lee and his indomitable aides and soldiers had been holding at bay brave and perfectly appointed armies vastly outnumbering them, and twice boldly assuming the offensive, with disaster indeed, yet with glory, 2 other grand campaigns had been going on wherein the Confederacy had fared much worse. The capture of New Orleans, of Island No. 10, and of Vicksburg had let the Father of Waters again run unvexed to the sea. A second line of operations via Murfreesboro, Chattanooga, Atlanta, and Savannah had divided the Confederacy afresh. Sherman's army, which had achieved this, began on February 1st, 1865, to march northward from Savannah. Bravery in camp and field, and deathless endurance at home could not take the place of bread. The blockade was, to be sure, for some time extensively evaded, admitting English wares of all sorts in great quantities. But in no long time the blockade tightened. Moreover, comparatively little cotton was raised which could in any event have been exported. Credit failing, imports, if any, had to be paid for in money. This, of course, was soon spent, and then importation ceased. Privateers destroyed, but could bring nothing home. As the war progressed, Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee, Louisiana, and with the fall of Vicksburg, the whole immense trans-Mississippi tract were lost to the Confederacy. Sherman's march isolated also Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. The dearth of necessities, save corn and bacon, became desperate. Salt and wheat bread were rare luxuries. In 1864, a suit of jean cost $600, a spool of cotton $30, a pound of bacon $15. It should, of course, be borne in mind that these high prices in part represented the depreciation of Confederate paper money. Drastic drafting and the arming of Negroes could avail little for lack of accoutrements and food. Thus Lee's capitulation at Appomattox, April 9, 1865, represents less a defeat of his army than the breakdown of the Confederacy at large. So true and impressive is this that reflection upon it makes the last year of Lee's commandership seem peculiarly glorious. Only by rarest genius, surely, were those dazzling tactics, that lynx-eyed, sleepless watchfulness, that superhuman patience and superhuman valor, protracted, incessant for a whole year, keeping intact, victorious, and full of inspiration that gray line, ever longer, ever thinner, of men outnumbered 2, then 3, and at last 5 to 1, whose food and clothing grew scantier with the days, while the bounties of a continent replenished their opponents, keeping that tenuous line unbroken till very starvation unfitted soldiers to handle muskets which must be used empty, if at all, because ammunition was spent. And when we recall that all this was accomplished not because the Union army was cowardly, ill-led, or asleep, but in spite of Grant's relentless push, and an ably led army as brave, wary, and determined as ever marched, let us ask critics versed in the history of war if books tell of generalship more complete than this. Lee's military conduct revealed, it must be admitted, one weakness, that of undue leniency towards slack, dilatory, and opinionated subordinates. This was, however, only in part Lee's personal fault. Mainly it was the military counterpart of the rope of sand infirmity inherent in a confederacy which in every possible way deified the individual state and snubbed the central power. Without jeopardizing the Confederacy, Lee could not at Gettysburg deal with Longstreet as Grant did with Warren at Five Forks, or as Sherman did with Palmer in North Carolina. It seems that Lee's orders to his main subordinates were habitually of the nature of requests. Yet what obedience was not accorded him in spite of this? Most striking among the characteristics of General Lee which made him so successful was his exalted and unmatched excellence as a man, his unselfishness, sweetness, gentleness, patience, love of justice, and general elevation of soul. Lee much loved to quote Sir William Hamilton's words, "On earth nothing great but man, in man nothing great but mind." He always added, however, "In mind nothing great save devotion to truth and duty." Though a soldier, and at last very eminent as a soldier, he retained from the beginning to the end of his career the entire temper and character of an ideal civilian. He did not sink the man in the military man. He had all a soldier's virtues, the chevalier without fear and without reproach, but he was glorified by a whole galaxy of excellences which soldiers often lack. He was pure of speech and of habit, never intemperate, never obscene, never profane, never irreverent. In domestic life he was an absolute model. Lofty command did not make him vain. The Southern Army had one prominent officer with a high ecclesiastical title, the Right Reverend Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk, D.D., LL.D., Bishop of Louisiana, commanding a corps in Bragg's army. He was killed in battle at Pine Mountain, Georgia, during Sherman's advance on Atlanta. Stonewall Jackson was so famed for his rather obtrusive, though awfully real piety, that men named him the Havelock of the army. But no one who knew the three will call Lee less a Christian than either of the others. He prayed daily for his enemies in arms, and no word of hate toward the North ever escaped his tongue or his pen. He had the faith and devotion of a true crusader. His letters breathe the spirit of a better earth than this. Collected into a volume, they would make an invaluable book of devotional literature. No wonder officers and men passionately loved such a commander, glad at his bidding to crowd where the fight was thickest and death the surest. Sir Thomas Malory's words are not inaptly applied to Lee. "Ah, Sir Launcelot, thou wert head of all Christian knights. Thou wert never matched of earthly knight's hand, and thou wert the courtliest knight that ever bare shield, and thou wert the kindest man that ever strake with sword, and thou wert the goodliest person that ever came among press of knights, and thou wert the meekest man and the gentlest that ever ate in hall among ladies, and thou wert the sternest knight to thy mortal foe that ever put spear in rest." Exquisitely appropriate is also Professor Trent's comparison of Lee with Belisarius and Turenne and Marlborough and Moltke on the one hand, and on the other with Callicratidas and St. Louis, with the Chevalier Bayard and Sir Philip Sidney. A remarkable trait of General Lee's military character was his tireless and irresistible energy. While one whom he deemed a foe of his state remained on her soil, he could not rest. From the moment he took command of the Army of Northern Virginia, all was action in that army. During the 9 weeks after A.P. Hill struck Mechanicsville that earthquake shock, how did not the war map change? Richmond was set free, Washington was threatened. Lee whipped McClellan before Pope could help, then Pope before McClellan could help. The first evening at Gettysburg, Longstreet having impressively pointed out the strength of Meade's position on Cemetery Hill, Lee instantly replied, "If he is there in the morning, I shall attack him." The second morning of the Wilderness battle, Grant, obviously expecting to anticipate all movement upon the other side, ordered charge at 5 o'clock. Lee charged at 4:30. Grant was determined to reach Spotsylvania first, but there, too, Lee awaited him, having had some hours to rest. Prostrate and half delirious in his tent one day during Grant's effort to flank him, he kept murmuring, "We must strike them. We must not let them pass without striking them." Longstreet was too slow for him, and so was even the ever-ready A.P. Hill. Years later, Lee's dying words were, "Tell Hill he must come up." To appreciate his cat-like agility, one must remember that Lee was the oldest general made famous by the war. It is thought that years accounted for Napoleon's refusal to fight the Old Guard at Borodino, as his ablest generals urged. Napoleon was then 43, 11 years younger than Lee was when our war began. It is to young Napoleon we must turn to find parallels for Lee's celerity. Second Bull Run in Chancellorsville may fitly be compared to Arcola and Rivoli. It has been observed that, like Napoleon, Lee avoided passive defense, seeming the assailant even when on the defensive. Like him, he was swift and terrible in availing himself of an enemy's mistakes. It can hardly be doubted that Lee's campaigns furnished more or less inspiration and direction for von Moltke's immortal movements in 1866 and in 1870–71. That Lee was brave need not be said. He was not as rash as Hood and Cleburne sometimes were. He knew the value of his life to the great cause, and, usually at least, did not expose himself needlessly. Prudence he had, but no fear. His resolution to lead the charge at the bloody angle, rashness for once, shows fearlessness. Tender-hearted as he was, Lee felt battle frenzy as hardly another great commander ever did. From him it spread like magnetism to his officers and men, thrilling all as if the chief himself were close by in the fray, shouting, "Now fight, my good fellows, fight." Yet such was Lee's self-command that this dreadful ardor never carried him too far. Once, namely at Fredericksburg, recovery from the fighting mood perhaps occurred too promptly. Some have thought this, suggesting that had the leash not been applied to the dogs of war so early, Burnside's retreat might have been made a rout. But Lee possessed another order of courage infinitely higher and rarer than this, the sort so often lacking even in generals who have served with utmost distinction in high subordinate places, when they are called to the sole and decisive direction of armies. He had that royal mettle, that preternatural decision of character, ever tempered with caution and wisdom, which leads a great commander, when true occasion rises, resolutely to give general battle or to swing out away from his base upon a precarious but promising campaign. Here you have moral heroism. Ordinary valor is more impulsive. A weaker man, albeit total stranger to fear, ready to lead his division or his corps into the very mouth of hell, if commanded, being set himself to direct an army, will be either rash or else too timid, or fidget from one extreme to the other, losing all. Hooker began bravely at Chancellorsville, but soon grew faint and afraid. Hood says that Hardee's timidity lost him a great victory at Decatur, Georgia, the day the Union General McPherson fell, and that Cheatham's at Spring Hill, during his northward pursuit of Thomas, lost him another. Yet Hooker, Hardee, and Cheatham were men to whom personal fear was a meaningless phrase. Stonewall Jackson was personally no braver than they. It was his bravery of the higher sort that set him as a general so incomparably above them. The same high quality belonged to Grant and Sherman, and to Washington and Greene in the Revolutionary War. It was in this supreme kind of boldness that Robert Lee preeminently excelled. Cautious always, he still took risks and responsibilities which common generals would not have dared to take, and when he had assumed these, his mighty will forbade him to sink under the load. The braying of bitter critics, the obloquy of men who should have supported him, the shots from behind, dismayed him no more than did Burnside's cannon at Fredericksburg. On he pressed, stout as a Titan, relentless as fate. What time bravest hearts failed at victory's delay, this dreadnought rose to his best, and furnished courage for the whole Confederacy. Lee's campaigns and battles exhibit the triumph of profound intelligence, of calculation, and of well-employed force over numbers and disunited counsels. Lee always maneuvered. He never merely pitched in. As he right-flanked McClellan, so both at Manassas and at Chantilly he right-flanked Pope, all 3 times using for the work Jackson, the tireless and the terrible. At Second Bull Run, to show that he was no slave to one form of strategy, he muffled up Pope's left instead of his right, here using Longstreet. His tactics were as masterful as his strategy. At Second Bull Run, fearfully hammered by the noble 5th Corps that had fought like so many tigers at Gaines's Mill and Malvern Hill, even Stonewall Jackson cried to Lee for aid. Aid came, but not in men. Longstreet's cannon, cunningly planted to enfilade the 5th Corps' front, shattered the Federals' attacking column and placed Stonewall at his ease. Considering everything, his paucity of men and means, the necessity always upon him of reckoning with political as well as with military situations, and his success in holding even Grant at bay so long, Lee's masterful campaigns of 1862, 1863, 1864, and 1865 not only constitute him the foremost military virtuoso of his own land, but write his name high on the scroll of the greatest captains of history, beside those of Gustavus Adolphus, William of Orange, Tilly, Frederick the Great, Prince Eugene, Napoleon, Wellington, and von Moltke. In a sense, of course, the cause for which Lee fought was lost, yet a very great part of what he and his confreres sought, the war actually secured and assured. His cause was not lost, as Hannibal's was, whose country, with its institutions, spite of his genius and devotion, utterly perished from the earth. Yet Hannibal is remembered more widely than Scipio. Were Lee in the same case with Hannibal, men would magnify his name as long as history is read. Of illustrious men, says Thucydides, the whole earth is the sepulchre. They are immortalized not alone by columns and inscriptions in their own lands. Memorials to them rise in foreign countries as well, not of stone, it may be, but unwritten in the thoughts of posterity. Lee's case resembles Cromwell's much more than Hannibal's. The regime against which Cromwell warred returned in spite of him, but it returned modified, involving all the reforms for which the chieftain had bled. So the best of what Lee drew sword for is here in our actual America, and, please God, shall remain here forever. Decisions of the United States Supreme Court since secession give a sweep and a certainty to the rights of states and limit the central power in this republic, as had never been done before. The wild doctrines of Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens on these points are not our law. If the Union is perpetual, equally so is each state. The Republic is an indestructible union of indestructible states. If this part of our law had in 1861 received its present definition and emphasis, and if the Southern states had then been sure, come what might, of the freedom they actually now enjoy, each to govern itself in its own way, even South Carolina might never have voted secession. And inasmuch as the war, better than aught else could have done, forced this phase of the Constitution out into clear expression, General Lee did not fight in vain. The essential good he wished has come, while the Republic, with its priceless benedictions to us all, remains intact. All Americans thus have part in Robert Lee, not only as a peerless man and soldier, but as the sturdy miner, sledge-hammering the rock of our liberties till it gave forth its gold. None are prouder of his record than those who fought against him, who, while recognizing the purity of his motive, thought him in error in going from under the stars and stripes. It is likely that more American hearts day by day think lovingly of Lee than of any other Civil War celebrity, save Lincoln alone. And his praise will increase. It was thoroughly characteristic of Lee that he would not after the war leave the country, as a few eminent Confederates did, and also that he refused all mere titular positions with high salaries, several of which were urged on him out of consideration for his character and fame. He was, however, persuaded to accept in 1865 the presidency of Washington College at Lexington, Virginia, an institution founded on gifts made by Washington, and at present known as Washington and Lee University. In this position the great man spent his remaining years, joining refinement and dignity to usefulness, and revered by all who came within the charmed circle of his influence. Since 1863 he had suffered more or less with rheumatism of the heart, and then from the middle of 1869 was never quite strong. Spite of this, with the exception of brief holidays, he performed all his duties till September 28th, 1870, when at his family tea table, as he stood to say grace, it was his wont to say grace before meat, and to stand in doing so, he was stricken, had to sit, then be helped to his bed. He never rose, though languishing a number of days. He died at 9 in the morning, October 12th, 1870. Ave Pia Anima. Authorities. E. Lee Child, Life and Campaigns of Robert Edward Lee, London, 1875. Edward A. Pollard, Life and Times of Robert Edward Lee, New York, 1871. John William Jones, Personal Reminiscences of Robert E. Lee, New York, 1874. Walter Taylor II, 4 Years with General Lee, New York, 1878. A. L. Long, Memoirs of Robert E. Lee, New York, 1887. Charles Marshall, Life of Lee. W. P. Trent, Robert E. Lee, Boston, 1899. William Allen, The Army of Northern Virginia in 1862, Boston, 1892. Battles and Leaders of the Civil War, New York, 1887. End of section 21. End of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 12, American Leaders, by John Lord.